Let's go. What's up? Check, check, check. Here we are. Tonight we're covering Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. And this will be a little bit of a different one, kind of fun. Yeah, we're doing a little night streaming here, a little Sunday night streaming. And this is interesting because the book was published in 2021 after the film, of course. It's a novelization of the film. And this is a sponsored stream. So first thing I got to do is give a shout out to our homeboy Ryan out there who sponsored the stream. Thank you so much, Ryan, for sponsoring the stream on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We'll also be covering another one of the books that you recommended, which is A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes. So thank you so much for the idea to do this. We're going to be talking about film and the movie and the contrast between the two. But really, the book is interesting because it it takes a lot of what the movie does and kind of it expands it. So you remember in the film, the we have kind of a dual. We have kind of two protagonists. We have Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth, played by Leo and Brad Pitt, respectively. The book really takes an emphasis in Cliff Booth's character because he's the more interesting character. Cliff Booth is the Brad Pitt character in the film. So, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the book. We're going to talk about the story, the narrative, what makes this a meta fairy tale, and what that has to do with how it's kind of a reflection of Hollywood in general. And we're also going to talk about, of course, Chaz Manson. We're going to talk about Chaz Manson and the family. We're going to be talking about the Jeff Gwynne book, Life and Times of Chaz Manson, which I read back in 2020. We'll be talking about Helter Skelter. We'll also be talking about sort of all things new Hollywood. Now, excuse me, folks. So what Cliff Booth is basically, as it says in the book, he's a kind of an Eisenhower era stunt double, Hollywood figure who finds himself in Dennis Hopper era Hollywood, right? I can't tell the difference between real life and the movies, man. So that's where some of the internal conflict lies. We will also find out much more about Cliff Booth's character, and it really this is interesting because Tarantino really takes. I mean, he's a the character of Cliff Booth is so pleasing to a film going audience in a number of ways because of his kind of his sort of and he never states his code, but he has kind of an internal code. Of course, I rewatched the movie A Few Good Men with Tom Coon this morning, and so I'm gonna use the word code a lot. I believe in things like code, honor, loyalty, right? Great movie. I love that movie. I can watch that movie sort of endlessly. But anyway, back to Tarantino. We're also gonna talk about Tarantino's other films, some of his other films, including Pulp Fiction, Reservoir Dogs, Jackie Brown, just in the context of the nonlinear narrative, which Once Upon a Time in Hollywood does not really do. It's pretty much a straight story, and I think there are a number of artistic reasons for doing that. But the book takes the nonlinear stance, and it's a little bit confusing at times, but that fits because the times are confusing, right? This is the era of flower power, man, right? And flower power, by the way, is a phrase that was coined by Allen Ginsberg, the poet Allen Ginsberg. And Ginsberg played a role at the Human Be-In. Remember that the thing with Timothy Leary, right? And Tune In, Turn On, Drop Out. Ginsberg was there reading his poems, and he coined the phrase. So thank you everybody for being here. Really appreciate you. Thanks for joining all of us tonight, and just looking at what makes this a sort of a meta narrative and a meta fairy tale. That's what I call it, a meta fairy tale, because it really is it's a Hollywood fairy tale in a number of ways. Now that's sort of semi ironic, if that's a thing, but we're going to look at how it sort of Hollywood takes a look at itself and folds upon itself. And so yes, please, thank you, for, liking the stream, sharing the stream. Please hit that subscribe button if you haven't subbed. If you're watching this, later, please just give me a little click. Just give me a little click and just click the subscribe button. It really helps me out a lot. We're trying to eventually get up to 2,000. We're about at 1,600 now, so we're trying to get up there. If you wanna support me, you can do that in the links provided by my beautiful, wonderful mods there, or you can click the down button on the video or on the about page. Number of ways you can support me. You can even just click that super chat button and support me that way if you want to. Yes, actually, Pim says Chris Hemsworth was the best, Chaz Manson in Bad Times at the El Royale, and I'm actually gonna, discuss that if I can remember to discuss it, but it's when I was reading the book, there's a certain section of the book which reminds me of that, and we'll get to that. So that's a good, parallel. If you haven't seen that movie, it's another recent movie that takes place. It's about, nobody has covered this stuff better, of course, than JD, Jay Dyer over at Jay's Analysis, our homeboy, and of course, Jerry, at Exposing Powerful Lies live streams. Jerry just recently covered the kind of what the culmination and the end result of the hippie movement and what it results in now. Jerry continuously covers that pretty expertly. Jerry and our friend Chase Haggard over there. So shouts out to them. That is a backdrop certainly to what this book is about. So here's what it's about. If you haven't seen my necklace is a Trinity knot because I went to school and grad school in Belfast and lived there for a few years. So it's a Celtic Trinity knot. So we're going to discuss the book, Hollywood, what goes into the backstory and the characterization. We're going to discuss Polanski and Sharon Tate, and of course Charlie Manson's music, Terry Melcher, Dennis Wilson. Um, we're of course we can't discuss this without talking about MK Ultra, Conspiracy of Silence, the Hell's Angels, Straight Satans, Black Panthers, political movements. All these things play into this thing that if there is a thing called the 60s as a movement, which there clearly is in terms of the culture, then this is the end of it. Many people say that the 60s began with the big November event, man, right, in 1963, and ended with Charlie Manson and with the Altamont murders, right, the Rolling Stones concert. If you haven't seen the documentary "Gimme Shelter," that's a good one to watch. But of course, also, a lot of people don't realize that the Summer of Love was not 1969; it was 1967. But that's okay. So Yes, and we're gonna talk a lot about Chaz Manson and where he came from. He was actually this is pretty weird, but, Chaz Manson was, in course, we don't have time really to talk into to talk and of course, Jay has talked about all this stuff so in so much depth, so we don't really need to go into it in that sense, but, um, Asselin Institute and a all of the things that really inform you about the story, but suffice it to say, he was, incarcerated from an early age and for most of his life, even before the events, and one of the place or I'll tell you 2 of the places where, he was locked up. One was at a, facility not too far from me, where I am now, when he was a youth. I didn't know that, until, uh, I guess a couple years ago, and the other, of course, is that this will inform people in the audience who know this, he was, at Boys Town, as part of the, we know Conspiracy of Silence, he was there. So, that actually just those fact that especially the latter fact, tells you a lot about what you need to know about Chaz Manson and cult activity. We also just covered one of the main, processes not the process church, but we haven't that's not really our purview here, but in terms of the process of cults, right? And one of the first things is in the induction, and the introduction into the cult would be the destruction of the ego, and we really just covered that in the stream that we did, last night, which was, Herman Hesse's Steppenwolf. So, if you haven't seen that, go check that out. Yeah, we keep grinding here, folks. Rise, grind, and shine. So we're gonna keep grinding. We're gonna keep plugging away and covering literature. And of course, our next stream, I'm not sure it won't be tomorrow night, but our next stream that we're gonna do will be Tennessee Williams and Streetcar Named Desire and Glass Menagerie. Thanks to Toledo down there in New Zealand who sponsored that stream. Again, if you want to sponsor a stream, you can drop me a fat chat, drop me $100 to cover a book. Give me a few different books to cover a list. If you want me to cover a film, give me a list. Email me, madmaximalism with 2x's at gmail.com, and I'll look into it. But most of all, this is just fun, right? We are doing deep analysis into literature, and we're having fun. Thank you also to Amy for that PayPal that you dropped at the beginning of the stream. Thank you so much. Really thank you so much for I appreciate you for supporting me. So let's get into it. Once upon a time in Hollywood. Again, thanks to Ryan out there. So here we go. It's interesting because the novelization, it's clever because Tarantino has builds that, like they say, world building, right? Which is not really true in terms of Tarantino, but it's more of an aesthetic than an entire world build. Like we're not talking Tolkien here, but one thing that runs as a constant throughout his works is the nostalgic kitschiness, right? Which with Pulp Fiction, obviously, Pulp Fiction is such a monumental film in terms of, he won the best screenplay, lost Best Picture to Forrest Gump. I actually went with a friend. I think, 14 when that came out. It was 1994, and I went to see it in the theater. And there's the particular scene in Pulp Fiction, right, that happens, and the grotesque scene, and I mean, it's so shocking, but it's also shocking to adults who watch it for the first time, or even for the 10th time. It's a shocking scene, and one of the things though that came out of Tarantino that I know everybody watching realizes this, but if you were alive at the time, especially, you will have noticed that one thing that Hollywood does is when someone creates a kind of sea change, right? In terms of the way movies are made or the way stories are told. That's what they're always saying in Hollywood. We like to tell stories, which is interesting because that's just another keyword for lies, right? But regardless of that, when they figure out a different way of filmmaking, a different, using film as a medium, whether it's like the advent of digital cameras or when script writing changes or whenever there's a major change in terms of Hollywood. It's always interesting to see how many works of art follow it, in a derivative fashion. And with Pulp Fiction, it was so stark because that's sort of what Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is about. It's about the major shift, the cultural shift that's happening at the time, and how Hollywood is at the forefront of that in culture creation. But also Rick Dalton, Leo's character, is a kind of a byproduct of the the shift that occurs, like in Hesse, right, between 2 ages, where you have the Eisenhower post-war, 1950s era that suddenly changes into the 1960s, and it's too fast for Dalton, and that's where a lot of his internal conflict and his anxiety arises from. Cliff Booth is also a kind of a victim of this, but deals with it in a completely different fashion. He's violent. Dalton is more of a brings out his violence in terms of his self-loathing, especially in terms of how he pursues film roles. That's the Leo character again. And, they find themselves in the midst of later leading up out of the '60s into so this is the tail end of the '60s into the '70s, which becomes like this Robert Evans New Hollywood movement. And we all know that the New Hollywood movement, if we I guess if we call it that, certainly an artistic movement, shifted Hollywood away from the kind of pinup characters, the kind of pinup protagonist with straight moral values into the anti-hero. So we go from really Dalton he keeps losing roles to Fabian. So I guess Fabian is kind of a good example of that, sort of a pinup actor who then the result of that is Rick Dalton railing against the fact that he has to look like one of these damn hippies and he has to wear this like mustache and he doesn't want to grow his hair out. But Sam Wanamaker, the director of the film within the film, wants to take advantage of this. Just like uh, once, just like other filmmakers have sort of taken advantage of the sea change that Tarantino began in the '90s. And so with actors, we go from these kind of pinup models to the real hard boiled street characters, more akin to real life in a way, that we get in the '70s. So, for instance, Al Pacino gets the role in The Godfather, right? And then in The Godfather 2, Gene Hackman is Popeye Doyle. We get the Serpico. Serpico is a great example of this because that's one of the things is within the film. The thing within the film is that it reflects sort of outer sentiments at the time. Serpico grows this beard and has long hair because he has to he has to blend in with the people on the streets, right? And audiences were still getting used to this, but Robert Evans really made this a thing in the '70s. And of course, we've covered that in light of Don Simpson's sea change into Hollywood excess, right? Yeah, with the remember we did the Don Simpson stream where if anything, we can see that as like the military industrial complex takes a major role in the filmmaking process in the '80s, unlike in a way they had done it before. Driving recruitment, driving the American propaganda system in the '80s, and all that. But this is a much more Once Upon a Time in Hollywood itself. The film is interesting because it's also one of these films that does like, no, I do not look like that. Jethro. Um, it's one of these things that, it comes in a sequence of films with Tarantino doing throwback movies or period pieces, right? He did The Hateful Eight, he did Django Unchained, he did Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now those are Westerns, but there is a Western element in this, certainly because in real life, right, we have the Manson family based at they're not based. I'm saying they're based at the Spawn Ranch, which is the broken down, degraded ruins of a constant, a continuous series of film sets. Even Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character, when he gets there, recognizes it. And in the book, he says he makes a statement to he's talking to Squeaky Fromm, and he says, "I've been here before. I know this place really well. I've fallen off, every horse that was ever here. I've been through every shanty. I've been down every dirt road. I've been up that hill over there. I've been out out in Death Valley." So he knows the place well, and so the conflict in that scene will come when Cliff Booth doesn't trust the fact that these filthy people have taken over this place. That is kind of a simulacrum of how Hollywood itself is being taken over in a way, if that makes sense. So, what happens in the film? If you haven't seen the film, I mean, if you've seen the film, then just bear with me for a second. What happens in the film is basically that we have Rick Dalton, that's Leonardo DiCaprio, who is a an actor in a television series called Bounty Law, and he has had some big successes, but he's lost parts. He's lost parts to Fabian, and in the book, he'll talk about losing parts to Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen plays a more central role in the book, especially towards the end of the book. And but he's bought a house in the Hollywood. Is it the Holly? I guess it's not the Hollywood Hills. Is it the Hollywood Hills? I don't know the geography of LA, but he's away from Laurel Canyon, and he's bought a property. And it's even a line in the film where he says, "Wasn't it great that we bought this property?" Because I guess Cielo Drive would be in the Hollywood Hills, Cielo, right? Uh, so Cielo Drive also, remember, before it was demolished, was where Trent Reznor recorded his albums at the Cielo Drive, 10050 Cielo Drive, the location of the Manson family murders. So he finds out that Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, who are married, are living right next door to him on the drive. And he's with his buddy, Cliff Booth, who is basically his gopher, but really is a kind of down and out, not down and out, but he's a stunt man who can't really get work or continuous work for a number of reasons. And those reasons are pretty interesting and they're fleshed out in the book. Um, and so he even says, he makes a statement about how it was wise to buy property rather than rent, as I assume all the other actors are doing at the time, because now he is one pool party away from getting a role in a Steve McQueen film. Steve McQueen also has obviously had a relationship with Sharon Tate, as has Jay Sebring. Jay Sebring, uh, played by I think Emil Hirsch in the film, but Jay Sebring, who's not much of a role in the book either, but Jay Sebring was the Hollywood hairstylist and suspected member of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, who is the origin of the Warren Beatty film Shampoo. And he was I guess, alleged dealer, and that's part of what we think is the real one of the real reasons for the event that took place, at least that event. The Rosemary and Lino LaBianca murder is separate and in a separate location, but from the book that I read, and from Helter Skelter is a weird book because it's Vincent Bugliosi, right? So Chaz Manson himself said, "No, looks all bullshit," right? And he may have a point to that. If you haven't listened to of all people, the Nicholas Schreck interviews with Manson and then Bobby Beausoleil, they're interesting. Now, of course, you have to have discernment and decide what is truth and what's not, and also was the whole thing the whole trial itself. Remember, this was the longest trial in U.S. history, besides the OJ trial and the McMartin trial. It was like 9 months, 9 month trial. And Nixon had already given his statement, which the defense found a problem with because it would bias the jurors. But Jay Sebring was one of the victims. And it was Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, the heir to the Folger coffee fortune, Sharon Tate. Also, Gary Hinman, who's often forgotten about. Gary Hinman is a alleged or suspected dealer who had ripped off the Straight Satan motorcycle gang, and Bobby Beausoleil and one of the others went, and that was when Manson cut off his ear. It was let's see. I can't remember which member it was. Basically, the members of the family, the ones that we're concerned with, that play roles in the film by name, but not so much in the book. Only Squeaky Fromm really plays a role in the book. But were, of course, Tex Watson, who was the instigator and committed most of the violence. Tex Watson, Squeaky Fromm. Squeaky Fromm was not convicted, but she's the caretaker and sort of the leader in the book, and she's the caretaker of George Spawn and Spawn Ranch. And she was later convicted of the attempted assassination of Gerald Ford. If you remember this story, what happened was, like, it turns out the gun wasn't loaded, but she was with someone, and they saw Gerald Ford. She pulled back the hammer, uh, pointed the pistol at Gerald Ford, and the Secret Service agent, like, put his finger or his thumb in between the right in front of the hammer so that the hammer couldn't she couldn't shoot the weapon. But then she was convicted. Linda Kasabian, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten were the members of the family. One of them testified against the others and so served no time. I think that was Linda Kasabian. Yeah, Leslie Van Houten, my note here in the book, Leslie Van Houten was, joined the family after she was forced to, have an abortion by her mother at 17, but she stabbed, Rosemary LaBianca 47 times. Susan Atkins was with, Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil is still serving, and he's the one who killed Gary Hinman, convicted of it. Um, Patricia Krenwinkel stabbed Abigail Folger. And let's see, Quickie Fromm's dad was a MIC engineer. He was an aeronautics engineer. And Tex Watson, of course, was from Texas. So was Sharon Tate, by the way. Sharon Tate hitchhiked to California, and Sharon Tate, of course, is also suspected of being a Satanist. I mean, she and Polanski both, but she was in Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Hunters in that scene, and we'll see that also Anton LaVey plays a role in the biography of Manson, but not in the book here, not in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But one thing that's interesting and funny about the book is the fake ads at the end of the book that are mixed in with the real ads. For instance, we have an ad for Serpico, the book, the novelization of the film. But then right after that, we have Ride a Wild Bronc, which is the book that Rick Dalton talks to the child actress about, and when they run lines together in the film. In the movie, they run lines together like over the phone, and she basically is responsible for like giving him some sort of um, like she's like, that was really good. You can be a great actor. She basically teaches him how to be an actor because he's so broken down and so full of anxiety, dread, and loathing. He's an alcoholic. And speaking of alcoholism, one thing that's interesting in the book is the discussion of Lee Marvin and George C. Scott. I didn't know that that George C. Scott had it written into his contract that three of his working days would be put aside for his hangovers for alcoholism. There's also a contrast between Rick Dalton and the fake Rick Dalton, the fictional Rick Dalton, and for instance, Richard Harris and Richard Burton, who he says those are professional drinkers. I can't keep up with them. All I can do is, it says in the book that like he's a product of being an actor in the 50s. He would have done anything to get out of being drafted in the war. He's a fake. He's an actor, right? But his sense of loathing leads him into alcoholism, and his one whiskey sour turns into 8 or 9 whiskey sours every night, and then he takes pills, and then he ends up blacking out, and then in the morning, he, does this routine he got from I forget who it is, but maybe from McQueen. No, from Paul Newman. He gets this routine he got from Paul Newman, which is, he sticks his face in a bowl of ice water every morning and tries to get back to reality, and then basically goes to his auditions or goes to his trailer if he's on a film set and cries. That's his character. Cliff Booth is an altogether completely different character. Cliff Booth is a stuntman played by Brad Pitt, and He's really interesting. So I'm gonna quit talking about it and just get into what happens in the book. So in the plot, sorry, I'm kind of going through a few digressions here. In terms of the plot, Rick Dalton gets a phone call from this guy Marvin Schwartz, and says, "We want to put you up for this western." And shouts out to Base Homeschool Mom out there. Shouts out to Chase TZ Mixkey Technor Graphics. And he goes for this role. He gets a role. I think somebody else has turned it down. It's going to be directed by this guy Sam Wanamaker, and it's gonna be kind of a hippie cowboy movie, But he's going to play the heavy, and there's a lot about the heavy and what the heavy means in terms of Hollywood role playing. The heavy is, wears black, becomes the kind of this morphs into the anti-hero because the as Tarantino says, the protagonist in the films in the 70s will turn into bloodthirsty, psychopathic sadists in a way that is supposed to reflect the some of the anger and the rage of the 70s, of the post 60s era, which is interesting how the flower power movement leads to this absolute psychosis, right? So he goes for this role, and Cliff Booth is kind of his driver, his gopher. He's also works as a stuntman, but they drive home, and then they leave, and then we see Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate is it's just kind of a Hollywood pastiche, right? Sharon Tate goes to a movie. She sees her own film. She laughs. Then we're introduced to the Manson family. One of them is hitchhiking back from the city out to the Spawn Ranch, which is way outside of L.A. Gets a ride with Cliff Booth. Cliff Booth drives her there. That's when he confronts the family, Tex Watson. It's totally different in the book than it is in the film, but he does go into the house and see George Spawn Ranch. Spawn is blind, doesn't remember Cliff Booth. But he wants to make sure that's one of the interesting things in the movie is and in the book that he wants to make sure that Spawn is aware of what's happening and he's okay with it. But Spawn has found a kind of a home with these family members, and Cliff Booth takes off. Not until he's had a fist fight and had with one of the family members, and he's left. But anyway, then what happens is later on in the movie, the way the movie ends, and so this is a spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. The way the movie ends, and this is why, my thesis, I guess, for this would be that the movie is a Hollywood fairy tale because I don't know about your experience seeing this movie, but I was I'm pretty well read and well versed in all things, Manson family and the events that happened. I said last night on the stream that, I read Helter Skelter in 7th grade. I read it again. It's just it's one of those things, I guess. But when you're watching the movie, you have this, at least I did, this overarching sense of dread throughout the whole movie because dramatic irony dictates that no matter what happens when we see Titanic, for example, we know that the ship is going to sink, right? We know that. So that's the dramatic irony. We know if we're watching Julius Caesar that any production dealing with Julius Caesar at all, not just the Shakespearean Caesar, which we've covered, is going to either end or have some sort of culmination in the assassination of Caesar. Now Shakespeare himself plays on that because the assassination takes place in Act 3 of the 5-act Julius Caesar. So he kind of does in a way, I'm not comparing Tarantino and Shakespeare, but he does he takes the audience expectations and he kind of flips it. Because also at the end of Julius Caesar, there are arguments to be made for both the protagonist and the antagonist. And who are they? Are they all antagonists? Are they all bad guys? Or are they all good guys? Or is one good, one's bad? You can make an argument for any of them in Caesar. But in terms of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, what happens is you're watching it thinking, I know this story, and no matter what happens, people are going to die at the end violently. It's gonna be horrible. So your expectations are kind of how is this story gonna play out? What's the narrative gonna be? How are Leo and Brad Pitt, how are Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth gonna play a role in this? Are they gonna be killed? Are they gonna be there? What's gonna happen, right? Because the the aesthetic of the movie is also bright and airy and yellow and kind of sun-soaked, and are we seeing that as a juxtaposition against the dark deeds that will occur at the end, or is this gonna be something else? And you don't really even know to question whether it's gonna be something else when you're watching the film. But what happens at the end of the film, spoiler again, what happens at the end of the film is the family, Tex Watson and Krenwinkel and Van Houten and Kasabian, break into the wrong they go to the wrong house, and the house is Rick Dalton's house. Rick Dalton is in the pool, lounging in the pool drunk, and Cliff Booth has dipped his cigarette in liquid LSD and is walking around with his pit bull. The pit bull is Chekhov's gun, right? Because we meet the pit bull early on in the film. We know this is a highly trained and, loyal dog, uh, and we don't know what's gonna happen, but it's a vicious dog, and what happens is they break into the house. Tex Watson says, that he's there working for the devil and he's there to do the devil's business, and Brad Pitt kinda looks at him like, "What?" Because he's tripping. Well, the expectations go right out the window because then the dog attacks Tex Watson, and the family members get annihilated one by one, including one with a flamethrower that Rick Dalton has from a World War II movie that he had completed. He had a train with a flamethrower. He kept the flamethrower, and all of the family members that are, not the whole family, of course, because in real life, I mean, Manson wasn't even there. This is the members that I mentioned are completely obliterated. And what this does is it it excites this sense of like elation in the audience because what could that these people are absolute scum and what they did. Yeah, and the dog is like again, it's Chekhov's dog. You know that the dog is there, but you don't realize it until the end what the dog was for, and the dog, saves the day. And uh we see these people just absolutely these horrible demon people obliterated and degraded into this sort of pulp farcical death. And what that does is it takes the real story and the real life events, throws them out the window and says this is like what could have been. So that makes it a fairy tale because it is as a happy ending. In the end, the cops come, they check it all out, and they're like, "Yeah, get rid of these damn dirty hippies." And the events never even happened in the first place in the life of the narrative of the movie. Then Dalton goes next door. He talks to Jay Sebring. Jay Sebring's alive, and then we know that he's going to go on and possibly start relationships with these people and go on and make movies. Now, this is why it's a Hollywood meta fairy tale because Hollywood itself is the Tinseltown land of dreams and fairy tales and all that they say. Now, that's why it's meta because it's a commentary on Hollywood itself and what it accomplishes, right? Or is supposed to accomplish. Now, that's taking it at an absolute, like, surface level because aside from the truth of this, which is that there are all sorts of shenanigans going on with intelligence and with drugs and with gangs and with mind control, right? All that goes out the window with this fairy tale movie. And in a sense, that is what movies do all the time anyway, right? In a way, movies are we get so much revelatory stuff from movies, and the movies obviously are, there's culture creation. But also think of how many movies you've seen that function as a limited hangout, right? Where they give you most of the truth, but leave behind the one thing that really matters that keeps the film, that keeps the truth from being the whole truth, right? And so it's lie by omission. And so s what the movie accomplishes is basically that we're walking out with this sense of like, "Oh, life, could be this way," even though it's almost more sinister because life wasn't this way and is not this way, right? And if it is this way, it's all what are we rooting for Rick Dalton, who is like, it's like he's this empty character. He's this empty guy who absolutely hates himself. And even though he like lives at the end and he may get work, he doesn't like experience any fullness or wholeness or salvation. His salvation is just like, oh, he's going to be in another movie and then he's going to hate himself again later. But the book actually does not end that way. In fact, and this is about the nonlinearity of the book and the way that Tarantino often will tell, will structure his movies. The the movie that actually occurs like as a side note halfway through the book. And the book actually ends with Dalton having made a film in Spain, which is also from the beginning. And, then at the end, like, talking to Steve McQueen and getting, they were in a film together, and then, like, oh, he's gonna go and be in a Steve McQueen movie later, and, like, so nothing really happens. It's in a way, it's kind of a burn after reading Coen Brothers film. Like, there are parallels with that because, like, not much really happens. There's no, like, growth, there's no redemption, and the sunset is the fake sunset of the sunset on screen, basically. We talked about in the Don Simpson movie how, um, he one of the aesthetic choices that he and Bruckheimer made in their films was that all their movies had to begin with a sunrise, which subconsciously shows the audience that it's a new day and we're being introduced to new characters and anything is possible. And then, of course, you take the 50s and 60s Hollywood films of like, remember the Green Berets, the film The Green Berets? This is one of the best examples of this. And this is why Hollywood sort of, that's a great example of a movie that Hollywood railed against because it took the truth of Vietnam and Green Beret actions and then simplifies them into this little package. And at the end of the movie, John Wayne walks off with the little Vietnamese boy into the sunset, and life is good, and the heroes have won. Where in reality, life is a lot more complex than that. And in fact, Cliff Booth is a Green Beret. They don't state that he's a Green Beret in this, but he makes statements about Green Berets, and all of his wartime activities in the book are basically Green Beret activities. So, so So, again, like and it also I happened to watch, Interview with the Vampire with, the Tom Cruise movie today, and it's interesting that one of the scenes there's so much synchro. One of the things that happens is that, like, as Louis, Brad Pitt's character, Brad Pitt in this and that, and that it's weird that that movie came on because it had nothing to do with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it just happened to be on. Anyway, Brad Pitt's character in that Louis, like, he can't see the sunrise. He can't be in the light. Remember the light burns Kirsten Dunst and the girl in Interview with the Vampire, and then 200 years go by, and then he's able to witness the first sunrise that he's seen in 200 years by going to the cinema. And the movie that he walks out of, by the way, in San Francisco, near the end of the film, is Tequila Sunrise with Mel Gibson and Kurt Russell. And Kurt Russell, of course, plays a role in this. There were a lot of weird things that happened while reading this. For instance, I was reading the book, and just to share with you guys, Synchro. I was reading the book, and they were discussing King Kong. And right when I read the words King Kong, Family Guy was on in the background, and they made a joke. They did like this whole sequence of events where like Mario and Donkey Kong, like it's an alternate Nintendo, and Mario asked Donkey Kong if he's any relation to King Kong, and and Donkey Kong says, like, "No, it's just a common name in the giant ape, like, world." But I read that exactly at the same time as they said King Kong. Also, um, there was another one, there were, like, four of those that occurred. Uh, I was watching something else in the background. What was it? This morning, and they mentioned Hamlet at the same time as Rick Dalton has a conversation. I was reading the book at the same time as the movie was on in the background. But they mentioned Hamlet at the same time that Rick Dalton is being talked to by Sam Wanamaker about Hamlet, which is just synchro, man. But that's often what happens with literature, right? This intertextuality and sort of intersexuality of art, and how the works of art tend to, not have a life of their own. They are interrelated and organic. Anyway, yeah, did it happen in 11:11? No, it happened at 9. No, I'm not going to say the rest of that. That was lame. Sorry. Um, okay, so let's see. Let's start off the book here. What it says. We get the chapter one is Call Me Marvin. Remember that Tarantino names his chapters within his movies. Also, he has chapters like it's a novel, even though they are nonlinear. Oh, one more thing about the nonlinearity. Obviously, the role of the nonlinear narrative i- uh, in something like Pulp Fiction is supposed to show you that you, the viewer, are left with a sense of the positive way that the film ends, because, like, that John Travolta and Jules, right? Vincent Vega and Jules walk out of the diner at the end of the film and they're alive. But you also know that that's actually not true, because Vincent Vega is going to die. That's why he's not um, at the, that's, remember, he gets Swiss cheese, right? He gets wet up by Bruce Willis in the apartment. So part of that is to show you that the confusion of the life of the characters, the content and the form are supposed to work together to produce the meaning of the work of art. And and again, what that shows you is that the characters live in a confusing world where the past and the future are all sort of interchangeable. You never know who's going to live and who's going to die because of the life that they lead. A couple of passages I just want to point out here. Um, Rick, at the end of chapter 1, Rick states, when he's talking to his agent, it says, Rick raises his eyes to the agent's eyes. Marvin finishes, "It's forgivable." Then Marvin smiles at the actor. Marvin is Al Pacino in the film. Right. It does require a bit of reinvention. What do I have to reinvent myself as? Rick says. Marvin answers, somebody humble. So we know that this Rick's conflict, Leo's character, Rick Dalton's conflict, is again with himself. He is completely self-loathing and egotistical and egocentric, and this plays a role in how the film ends, because he's almost like a character in someone else's movie in real life, because the murders are taking place and Cliff Booth is killing this woman inside, that and Tex Watson, these people that have come to slash them to death, and yet he's just completely unconscious in the pool, um, like practicing lines, until finally this sort of Deus ex machina occurs, where he grabs the flamethrower and annihilates. I forget which one of the girls he burns. Um, but then let's see, just to talk about Cliff Booth, on page 30 of this book, it says, when Cliff and Miss Himmelstein saw I Am Curious, Yellow, at the Royal Cinema in West LA that Sunday afternoon, they both liked it. I Am Curious, Yellow is, I guess, supposed to be a take on the curious life of, what is it? The Curious Life of Christian. Forget the name of that movie, but it's supposed to be basically a take on, like, the Eurocentric eroticism that's making its way into Hollywood with the loosening of morals. And he takes her on a date to this film. When it comes to cinema, Cliff is far more adventurous than his boss. To Rick, movies are what Hollywood made. And with the exception of England, all other countries' film industries are simply the best they can do, since they're not Hollywood. But after all the blood and violence Cliff experienced during World War II, once Cliff returned home, he was surprised at how juvenile he found most Hollywood movies. There were some exceptions: the Oxbow Incident, Body and Soul, White Heat, The Third Man, The Brothers Rico, Riot, and Cell Block 11, but they were the regularities in a fake normalcy. After the devastation that the countries of Europe and Asia experienced during Second World War, Once those countries slowly started making movies again, oftentimes surrounded by the bombed out rubble remnants of the war, they discovered they were making them for a far more adult audience. While in America, and when I say America, I mean Hollywood, a country where its home front civilians were shielded from the gruesome details of the conflict, their movies remained stubbornly immature and frustratingly committed to the concept of entertainment for the whole family. Now, obviously, part of that deals with culture creation and the sort of new world order. And new world order is mentioned in the book a number of times that America is promoting in the post-war era. To Cliff, who had borne witness to the stark extremities of humanity, like the heads of the Filipino guerrilla brothers stuck on spikes by the occupying Japanese, even the most entertaining actors of his era, Brando, Paul Newman, John Garfield, Robert Mitchum, George C. Scott, always sounded like actors and reacted to events the way only characters in movies did. There was always a level of artifice to the character that stopped it from being convincing. After he got back to the States, Cliff's favorite Hollywood actor was Alan Ladd. He liked the way the diminutive Ladd would practically swim in the modern 40s and 50s fashions he wore. He didn't care for him in westerns or war films. He disappeared in cowboy attire and military uniforms. Ladd needed to be in a suit and tie and preferably a snap brim fedora. Cliff liked his look. He was handsome without being movie star handsome. Since Cliff was so damn handsome, he appreciated other men who weren't, but didn't need to be. Alan Ladd looked like a few guys he served with. He also liked that Ladd looked like an American, but he loved the way the little guy fought fistfights in his movies. He loved how he socked the shit out of the character actors who specialized in playing gangsters. He loved that droopy lock of hair that hung in his face during the fight, and he loved how Ladd used to roll around on the floor with the heavies. But his absolute favorite thing about Ladd, his voice. He had a no nonsense way of delivering his lines. When Ladd acted opposite Ernest Borgnine, for instance, they all seemed like ham-bone actors when compared to him. When Ladd got mad in a movie, he didn't act mad. He just got sore, like a real fella. As far as Cliff was concerned, Alan Ladd was the only guy in movies who knew how to comb his hair, wear a hat, or smoke a cigarette. Okay, Mitchum knew how to smoke a cigarette too. And then he talks about when he saw foreign movies, the actors had a level of authenticity that just wasn't there in Hollywood movies. This is again because of the wartime destruction and how they're making movies in the rubble, especially in post-war Japan. Hands down, no question about it. Cliff's favorite actor was Toshiro Mifune. He gets so into watching Mifune's face, he'd sometimes forget to read the subtitles. The other foreign actor Cliff dug was Jean-Paul Belmondo. When Cliff saw Belmondo in Breathless, he thought, that guy looks like a fucking monkey, but a monkey I love. When Paul Newman played a bastard like in HUD, he was still an enjoyable bastard, but the guy in Breathless wasn't just a sexy stud prick. He was a little creep, petty thief, piece of shit. And unlike in a Hollywood movie, they didn't sentimentalize him. They always sentimentalize these pieces of shit in Hollywood movies, and it was the phoniest thing in Hollywood did. In the real world, these mercenary fuckfaces didn't have a sentimental bone in their body. That's why Cliff appreciated Belmondo not doing that with his little shitheel in Breathless. Foreign films, Cliff thought, were more like novels. They didn't care if you liked the lead characters or not, and Cliff found that intriguing. That's pretty enlightening or revelatory by the speaker here. It's also, it is, of course, it's ironic because Tarantino does that with his characters. He makes these shitheel characters like so likable. But that may be because they are charming and because that's the way that it is in real life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that they do. But it's also interesting because it's like we see the speaker here laughing at himself. And I do agree with him also about Toshiro Mifune, who is one of my favorite actors and is so awesome. He's like, I can picture I can picture like Interview Magazine or something saying like, this is the Japanese Brando. But it's like, no, this guy, I mean, I like Brando, but this guy is so hard boiled and so he has a lot of depth. There's a scene later on in the book where Sam Wanamaker will tell Rick Dalton that, listen, we're gonna do a close up and we're gonna see the whole thing through your eyes. You gotta do this in your eyes. And that actually that's one of the things they taught us at drama school when we were doing television and film training. Geez, Derek, I'm not a professional film and television actor. I've been working here 47 years. Right. Um, Merman is that John Voight's also a product of this of the 70s of the new Hollywood. But they tell us that like most of see, film acting is different from theater acting because it's mostly in the eyes, and that's why a lot of times great stage actors will not make it in film. They won't even have a shot because they do a screen test and they're used to playing to an audience with with more expression with their body instruments, so they say. But in film, it's mostly in the eyes. You have to believe what the and everybody knows this watching any film that you have to believe it in the eyes of the actor, right? It has to be read in the eyes. And Mifune gets this. Mifune is in the Kurosawa movies. You recognize him from Throne of Blood, which is a remake of Macbeth. He wasn't in Rand, which is a remake of King Lear. We discussed that. Um, I don't know, I can't remember if he was in The Bad Sleep Well, which is Hamlet. But isn't that Hamlet? Is that the Kurosawa Hamlet? Some film buff will know that. But he was in Yojimbo, The Hidden Fortress, The Seven Samurai, of course. He's like the main dude. He's like the samurai. He's amazing. Toshiro Mifune is amazing. And oh, it's interesting. Yeah, Crisp says the ears are important too. But actually, this is pretty interesting that one of the things is that um, one of Cliff's criticisms of actors, because he's a stuntman, is that all actors do is react. And we always hear this about acting is about reacting. Yeah, Rashomon, forgot Rashomon Jethro. Good call. Um, but but like we always hear this about actors, are have to react, but Cliff says that this is bullshit. This is why acting is bullshit because in real life the reacting is so ingrained in the personal interactions that you have, and that actually the man's action is more important because he's basically what he says is like that may be true about actors, but it also shows why acting is acting and not real life. No matter what, especially the new Hollywood people, no matter how authentic they want to make it. Um, let's see. Let me find another passage about Cliff here. And this is fleshed out from the film. The other real cool cachet that Cliff Booth brought to the party, as well as being a good friend, a good stuntman, and a war hero, because Cliff has won the Medal of Valor twice. He served in Japan, he served in the Philippines, he served in all these places during World War II. Um, in this world of make believe, Cliff was a real killer. Just on his television show alone, Rick killed something like 242 people. That's not counting how many Indians and Alhus he killed in his Western movies or those 150 Nazis he killed in the 14 Fists of McCluskey. And when he played the twisted black leather glove psycho killer in Jigsaw Jane, such a Tarantino name. The dispatch most of his victims with a shiny silver stiletto. Rick remembers drinking booze and discussing his Jigsaw Jane character with his stunt double at the bar located inside the smokehouse off of Riverside Drive. As they talked and drank, Rick asked Cliff, had he ever killed an enemy soldier with a knife? Plenty, answered Cliff. Plenty, Rick repeated, surprised. How many is plenty? What? Cliff asked, you want me to sit here and count? Well, yeah. Well, let's see, Cliff thought. He started counting silently to himself on his fingers until he ran out of fingers and had to take another lap around the track when he stopped and said 16 with a knife. If Rick's whiskey sour had been in his mouth at the time, he'd have come close to doing a comedic spit take. You killed 16 fucking guys with a knife? He asked incredulously. Um, Japanese in the war, Cliff clarified. Yeah. Rick got quiet, leaning forward, asking his buddy, how'd you do it? Do you mean how could I do it mentally and emotionally? Cliff asked, or how did I do it physically and practically? Wow, good question, Rick thought. Well, I guess first, how did you do it? Well, not every time, but most of the time it was me coming up behind some joker and taking them by surprise. A rock gets caught in some guy's shoe. He straggles behind his company, take off the shoe, get rid of the rock. I come up behind him, stick a knife in his ribs, hold my hand over the mouth, twist the knife till I feel him give up the ghost. Fuck, Rick thought. But uh not not how I for sure killed him. Did he did he die because of me or did he die because he got a rock in his shoe? Interesting philosophical question from Cliff. Just let me get this straight, Rick clarified. You stick a blade in some guy's ribs, then you cup a hand over the mouth, squashing the scream, then hold him through the whole damn death rattle till he dies in your arms. You remember that story about Christopher Lee? Um, telling, uh, what's his name? Who's the guy who directed Peter Jackson? Telling Peter Jackson that the way they were doing one of the death scenes in Lord of the Rings was all wrong, and he knew by experience because he had Christopher Lee was supposedly in the. I don't know if he was in the SAS. I mean, he was in the Royal Air Force. He wasn't in that. I don't think he was in the SAS, which would be Long Range Reconnaissance Group or Long Range Desert Group at the time. But basically, Christopher Lee said, no, when you stab a guy, uh, they don't scream out in pain, they gasp or inhale. And so I found some parallels with that. Also, there are parallels in the book. When I was reading the book, there was a mention of how uh, Rick is telling the director like he can't do something in the scene, and basically Wanamaker says something about, well, it's called acting, dear boy. And I immediately, of course, thought of Laurence Olivier and his reaction to Dustin Hoffman that we've discussed before on Marathon Man, right? Remember, Dustin Hoffman stayed up for 3 days in Marathon Man, and Olivier plays the former torturer, right? Is it safe? And he came in all distressed, and he was like, "I've been up for 3 days." Or, I can't do it, Dustin Hoffman, but trying to get in character. And Laurence Olivier just simply said, "Well, try acting, dear boy." Remember, Christopher Lee. No, no, Peter Jackson, you have it all wrong. You see, I can see. I can't do Christopher Lee. Um, let's see, Roman and Sharon Polanski. Okay, here's a bit about Polanski if you guys want to hear it. The diminutive uses the word diminutive again. Polish auteur in the driver's seat. Apart from Mike Nichols, no other young director at the time was more successful or more famous than Roman Polanski, but the Polish megaphone wielder had a level of popularity that eluded his stage and screen colleague Nichols. In 1969, Roman Polanski was a rock star. He made a name for himself when he directed his first feature, the Polish language Knife in the Water. The film was a hit on the foreign film circuit, was even nominated for Best Foreign Film at the Academy Awards. Two of the films that he made, Cul-de-sac and The Fearless Vampire Killers, where he met his wife Sharon, were admired, but didn't take much of a mark financially. But his psychological thriller Repulsion was a sleeper hit that broke out of the art house ghetto that into mainstream success. After a slew of bad Psycho copies from Hammer Studios, yes, I was at Hammer Studios for many years. And I must say that The Wicker Man was the most intelligent script I'd ever read. Um, it says coming out of France, like Pulse Devoid, Roman de Guerre of Claude Chabrol, or The Amateur Night in Paris, Fumblings of the So-Called Truffaut Hollywood Films, Francois Truffaut, who was a friend of Jim Morrison, along with Polanski's London set psycho-ish thriller Repulsion. When it came to how to do a modern-day Hitchcockian thriller for a with an audience, Truffaut also played the Jacques Attali character in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Isn't that right? Didn't he act in that film? Jethro will know. When it came to how to do a modern day Hitchcockian thriller for a with an audience that pulsed to a swinging London beat with Repulsion, Roman cracked the code. Polanski's character study of twisted paranoia, starring the beautiful but damned Catherine Deneuve, worked. Catherine Deneuve is excellent. Remember, she was in The Hunger that we covered as part of the vampire streams. Um, Polanski's audience disturbance was the point. Polanski's Hitchcockian thriller, by way of Buñuel, struck a chord with audiences after Polanski showed he had a penchant for getting under an audience's skin with Repulsion. Head honcho of Paramount Studios, Robert Evans, there he is. Remember, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, invited him to come out to Hollywood and make a movie. Creeper. He lured Roman, an expert skier, into his office by sending him a script for an upcoming movie on their slate about competitive skiing called Downhill Racer. And then in a decision that would later make Paramount's stock price go up 3 points, Evans handed him the novel of Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby and said, read this. The rest, as Marvin Schwartz would say, the fictional agent in the film, is horror movie history. Balaban is supposed to portray someone too. Yeah, I don't know who Balaban is in the movie. I mean, I know who he is. He's the main guy, one of the main guys in the movie, but I can't remember who he's supposed to portray. Let's see. So, it's also interesting on page 58, they talk about they're giving a plot summary of Rosemary's Baby. And I don't know if I'd ever made this obvious connection before, but the ambitious actor named Guy Woodhouse, played by John Cassavetes, um, let's see, and it's John Cassavetes, and then Ruth Gordon and Sidney Blackmer's character are Minnie and Roman Castevet. I never put that together. Little does poor Rosemary know the couple are a pair of Satanists looking for a vessel to birth the long prophesied Antichrist. Of course, if you haven't seen Rosemary's Baby, you got to see Rosemary's Baby. Because remember, Anton LaVey supposedly was on the set, and it was his hands that um, are in the frame going towards the crib at the end of the movie. LaVey was in that other movie, The Devil's Rain. The Devil's Rain is interesting because it's such a bad movie, but Ernest Borgnine, 33rd Degree, Ernest Borgnine, Illuminate Confirm, plays a priest of the Church of Satan, and his assistant in the movie is Anton LaVey. Like Anton LaVey is playing the act is in the movie. And the movie also has an early John Travolta, and John Travolta was introduced to Scientology on the set of that film. But more interestingly than that, um, William Shatner is in the movie, and the mask that William Shatner wears of his own face in the movie is the very same mask that they later used for Michael Myers. I know you guys probably know that. Michael Myers' mask is the William Shatner mask. It's William Shatner's face from The Devil's Rain. Terrible movie. Um, let's see. Um, so then it talks about the conspiracy they've perpetrated against Rosemary, and that's how Roman Polanski made his way. Oh, there's a great part in this about Roman Polanski's filmmaking, and it's interesting because it's from Tarantino's point of view, and I thought we should cover that. I'll just summarize it. Basically, when Polanski was filming the movie and they were in, it takes place in the Dakota Building, right, right on Central Park, and the Dakota Building, of course, you'll know is the place where the Catcher in the Rye guy shoosted Jonathan Lennon right outside the Dakota Building because Jonathan Lennon was living in the Dakota Building. Well, anyway, the film takes place there, right, and there's a scene where Rosemary is looking down the hallway, and there's a phone call, and Ruth Gordon, you'll know her from Harold and Maude also. I think who knows, but I suspect she was probably a Satanist in real life. But anyway, uh, I say that, well, anyway, I won't speculate on that anymore. But anyway, so there's a scene where she gets a phone call, and Rosemary is looking down the hallway, and you can look down the hallway and you can see Ruth Gordon, but she's on the phone, and I think she's talking to the psychiatrist who is in cahoots with he's one of the coven. And Rosemary, like, is trying to look at Ruth Gordon, but Polanski had her steps slightly out of frame, so she's, like, standing was here, she's standing, like, over here. And there's a doorway in the middle, and Sharon Tate saw him filming the scene and said to him, um, "Why are you doing that? Why are you filming it that way? We can't see her." Right? It kinda breaks the rules of continuity in filmmaking. And Polanski basically said, Y just it's fine, it's fine. Just keep going, keep going." And then later, when they went to go see the film, Polanski, when he saw films, he would sit up front right in front of the screen, but when he saw his own films, he would sit in the back of the theater, and Tarantino, or the speaker in this, says the reason for that was because Polanski was watching the audience watch his film. He wasn't watching his film, he was watching the audience. And when that part came up in the film, he said, "You remember that? Remember when we were filming that scene? This is it. Watch." And so he said, "Watch the audience." So when they showed the film, and it was their first time seeing it, of course, the audience all together went like this. They looked to see if they could see around the door frame to look at Ruth Gordon. And so Sharon Tate said, "Oh my gosh, I'm married to this guy knows what he's doing, right?" Yeah, she was married to this creep. But he knew what he was doing in terms of the film, And basically, the reason was Tarantino's reason is, of course, why did he do that? To control the audience. To He was doing their thinking for them, and it was because he could, right? Which is a general rule with art, especially film. And you're leading the audience, you're coercing the audience, and again, that plays a role in this film because that's part of breaking the audience's expectations as to what you expect to happen and what's going to happen. Because the best really, I mean, think of the best films you've seen. The best films and the best books are ones where you can't predict what's going to I mean, prediction is high up on, Bloom's taxonomy, right? It's high up on the level of cognitive awareness in terms of events or in terms of any intellectual pursuit. It's the ability to, you can understand the material you're taking in, then you can mimic, you can mimic the material, you can memorize it, and then you can create, but also you can predict the future based on the material, right? So, Rachel says, I'm the best hand model since George Costanza. That's a high compliment. Thank you. Bulova watch catalog, 1988. That's Zoolander, but but Costanza, I'll take that. Thank you. But also, um, because form and content meld together in the work of art, and again in Rosemary's Baby, since the film is about control and the audience is wondering how much of this conspiracy is in Mia Farrow's mind and how much of it is true, and it turns out, right, that it is true. It's both in her mind and true. So there is an objective conspiracy in the film. And so the audience becomes part of this when they watch the film because they are being led into expectations. And the look around the corner is one great way of visualizing that. Um, let's see. We talk about here's the part about Cliff's dog. Cliff did have one female in his life that he loved and who loved him back. His flat-headed, bent-eared pit bull with a reddish-brown coat, Brandy. We get a backstory and characterization to Brandy and why Brandy is the way that she is, the dog, in the book. And I'm not gonna cover it because I don't like it. But suffice it to say, she is made to be vicious. But she is one great thing that Tarantino does uh is that a guy owes Cliff money, and instead of paying him the money that he owes him, he says, "Look at this dog, Brandy. I can get you your money back by going through this series of things that they put the dog through." Okay? And, um, Cliff does not like this, but the guy eventually, like, gets him his $20,000 and he says and then, eventually the scumbag says, you can get the dog, but we can make 40,000 tonight." And Cliff says, and Cliff's like, You're there's no way that there's one last chance. I'm taking the dog." And the guy says, "No, we're gonna put her through it." And Cliff kills him viciously. Cliff kills a lot of people in the book. Um, he kills some mafiosi, and one of the backstories about and then he rescues the dog, and of course that's Brandy, and Brandy rescues the day, or saves the day in the novel. But he's a great, master to this dog because he's firm without a firm hand, right? He's because they've both been through war. I mean, Cliff has been through literal war and the dog has been through a war of its own. So, but Cliff, what it says is that Cliff doesn't get work as a continuous stuntman on films because no matter what film set he's on, everyone knows that he's for real. And not just as a war hero, but they know and they suspect that he's killed people and gotten away with it. And in fact, he says that to the mafiosi when he meets him. He says, he said he takes out a gun on the table and he says, "I could put a hole in you guys' heads right now and I'd get away with it. Nobody would give a shit." And they say, "No, you would." Bam. And then he does that. And then, of course, he gets away with it because then the authorities come and he says, "Look, these two guys were robbing me. I was scared, and I'm armed. I'm a medal of valor. I was in the war." And they say, "Oh, you were in the war too? Don't worry about it. Go on back home." Right. So in the book, he has his own code and he is a much more prominent character than he is in the film. We meet we meet Charlie finally, like, on page 90, it talks about creepy crawling and how he gets the girls to go in and creepy crawl, and he tells them to squash their ego, and that's a really it's a backdrop, um, to the story. It doesn't really focus on the actual Manson events that much. Really, all it goes into is the fact that, um, you know, Chaz Manson had a burgeoning record deal with Terry Melcher. Terry Melcher kinda backed out of it. However, you probably know this, but did you know that Manson does have songs on is it the Beach Boys album 2020? And on a Crosby, Stills& and Nash album. He's credited as the songwriter. Of course, he has his own album that he later recorded. "Look at your game, girl." Remember that song that Guns N' Roses covered as the hidden track on the Spaghetti Incident? It's pretty esoteric, but that was his song. But anyway, Terry Melcher kinda welched on this and Dennis Wilson. One of the family members, by the way, supposedly the guy who crashed Dennis Wilson's Ferrari. They were all living at Dennis Wilson's house, and Manson shows up basically because the record deal falls under. Have you guys seen that interview with Neil Young? It's pretty, that's a pretty revelatory interview. Neil Young says they ask him about, Manson, and he says, did you know Charlie?" And he says, "Oh, I knew more than just knew him. I knew him well. And he was a songwriter, and he was talented. You know, he was only 5'2". But he was a songwriter. He was magnetic, and he did write songs. I knew, and he knew him well. Crosby knew him, of course. David Crosby saying this, knew him. A lot of that, of course, has been covered. There's not really any point in covering it here because it's been covered with so much depth and expertise by number one in the Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon book by Dave McGowan and of course by Jay. Um, but he gets them to do their creepy crawl, and then later on we meet. Let's see, yeah, Dennis Wilson gave Charlie a motorcycle. Um, there's a reference to oh, the reason Cliff Booth is not welcome on movie sets is because he has killed real people, and the third round of his killings was his wife, and whom he split in half with a spear gun, on a ship. It's not funny, but on a ship, when she's, berating him, and it says that everybody in the book, like all the stunt crews, knew that, like, if they, she opened her mouth to talk, like you knew it was bad news because she was gonna berate him, and finally, he's standing there with a spear gun. He holds her in half, like, in together for 8 hours until the authorities get there, and then she kind of falls apart and dies. It's kind of like in the M. Night Shyamalan Ding Dong movie, remember where the car splits, Mel Gibson's wife? But this is also a reference to, of course, Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner, and Chris Walken was, supposedly also on the boat. But he can't get work because even though they can't prove it, they all know that it probably happened. Rudy Altobelli is the guy who owns Cielo Drive. He's renting the house out to Hollywood bigwigs, and he owns Cielo Drive. That's where Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate live, and he lives in the guest house. He was there the night of the murders. Um, we have again there in the movie. One of the big set pieces is they go to a party at the Playboy Mansion. Right, they go to a half party, and of course, you can't help but think yes, signs. Thank you to my sister. You can't, I mean, how can you not think that the mansion itself served as an Operation Midnight Climax, blackmail operation with two-way mirrors and recording devices, listening devices, and all that. I know from the Elvis biography that Elvis had his own suite there. Most people don't know that. When he was living in Bel Air, he had a suite there. And anyway, in the film, they go there and they see Steve McQueen, and he's there. But later on, did you know that Hugh Hefner financed Roman Polanski? He actually produced the Macbeth film that Polanski made right after Macbeth was the first movie that Polanski made after the murders, and that was shocking at the time because of the amount of blood and because of the scene where Lady Macbeth goes in and cleans up, and when Macbeth, violates the violates the sort of pseudo sanctity of his home, right, by killing his kin, Duncan. And the amount of blood that they showed in the film was also violent. There's also a scene where um, Macduff's family is home invaded and murdered, which is an obvious mirror of the events that had just taken place. But Hugh Hefner financed that film. Um, let's see. We have the great scene where there. Well, before we get to that, there's another scene where we see that Rick Dalton's conflict is his uselessness. It says he on page 197, he opens his mouth and tries again to say useless, but the words stick in his throat. On his third attempt, he croaks out useless each day, followed by a stream of tears that leak out of his eyes and run down his hairy face, folding him up like a jackknife. So it's his uselessness that leads to his sense of self-loathing. Uh, the next chapter, The Sweet Body of Deborah, page 202. While everybody in the stunt community knows Cliff Booth is Rick Dalton's stunt double, it's not the thing he's most known for. It's just the most legitimate thing in the stunt community he's known for. On the list of things that Cliff Booth is known for, it ranks about number 4. The number 1 thing he used to be known for was his incredible military record, having more confirmed kills of Japanese enemy soldiers than any other American serviceman fighting in the Pacific Theater is one hell of a feat. And that's just confirmed kills. Ask any of his Filipino brother resistance fighters how many unconfirmed kills of Japanese enemy soldiers Cliff Booth was responsible for. Their answer would be, who fucking knows? So again, his Filipino brother resistance fighters is like Merrill's Marauders. This guy's an early Green Beret. But once there was widespread speculation that in 1966, Cliff Booth killed his wife, his status as a war hero became the second thing he was most known for inside the stunt community. This talks about how he's known as a ringer. So Tarantino explains that a ringer in terms of Hollywood is basically somebody who's a stuntman who's brought in when the stuntmen are being berated by an obnoxious director. They bring in a ringer like Cliff Booth. So what happens is he's on a of course a fictional set of an Otto Preminger film, and it says the ringer can do what the stunt team can't, which is basically fuck the shit out of this guy, fuck his shit up, preferably in front of the whole crew. Say you're working in the broiling hot sun of Mississippi for a year with that bald Nazi bastard Otto Preminger on Hurry Sundown, and that sadistic prick has belittled and berated crew members in front of the whole company for an entire year. So you hire Cliff Booth as a stunt day player and have him purposely fuck up a shot in front of Otto. Then you and the crew just sit back and enjoy the show. Booth socked Preminger mid tirade in the jaw, knocking him flat into the Mississippi mud. Cliff's excuse was, as a World War II hero, he experienced a wartime flashback when Preminger yelled at him in his German Gestapo accent and he forgot where he was. And when the production manager gave him his bus ticket home the next day, Cliff left Mississippi with an extra off the books $700 in his back pocket. That's pretty funny. Maddie drops a super chat and says, I know you don't really do reviews on this channel, but what's your take on Tarantino as a novelist, especially compared to his skill as a screenwriter? Well, I think that's a good question which requires a nuanced answer. I'll try to be brief here. Tarantino is obviously the book functions as a kind of novelty novel. Okay, and what I mean is that Tarantino is not a novelist. We read the book as kind of not like fan fiction, but it's supposed to be a uh, cinematic backdrop characterization set piece for how the film works. So we're under no illusion as a reader that Tarantino is a novelist, but it doesn't really matter because as he says in the book, film is a new medium. It continues to be a new medium, but especially back then, it still wasn't that old. But film is a medium that is different in terms of its artistic validity than novels or an opera or a play, but it is valid nonetheless. Just because it's new doesn't make it non-valid. And so that is where Tarantino that's his medium. And he's a great screenwriter, obviously. part of his screenwriting now is it's become absorbed into the culture so much that it's almost cliche. I mean, the how verbose and kitschy and nostalgic the characters' conversations with each other are, and that's transitioned over time in his films, but we still do get long character building, dialogue. The dialogue is what's important in his films. It's interesting because we don't film shows us, right? The great films show us. But a lot of the work of his narrative here is simply backdrop in like a shot in a film. We can read into the shot in the film what we are meant to take from it. So we don't need the verbiage. But at the same time, the great that's why the great books, books in general usually outweigh the novel because whereas in the film we're presented with the image that we can't turn away from. In other words, we're presented with an image or a story or a time or a place, and we have to take what the filmmaker gives us. We can't choose to if Django Unchained is set in Mississippi, we can't, like, change it to 1950s Texas or something. It just doesn't work. It's there. That's what we get. But when we're reading, all of that work is done in our own mind, in our own imagination through the words of the writer. Um, yes, Talita says Tarantino is great with writing dialogue. Great question, Maddie. Thank you. Yeah, if you want to send a super chat, if you want to support me, please don't hesitate to drop a super chat. We really appreciate you. Again, thank you for that $10 PayPal from Amy, and thank you for that $10 from our homeboy Maddie at the Real Cooter Brown at Digital Minefield. Check out his channel. Jethro says none of his others compare to the first time I saw Pulp Fiction. Just in my opinion, the rest drop off from there. Well, no, that's true. I mean, I totally agree with you. And um, there's a lot to be said for Reservoir Dogs, but and Reservoir Dogs is a great film, but it's a completely different film than Pulp Fiction. It's a kind of a a an elementary, like, it's a basic level before you get to something like Pulp Fiction. I think that the most fun Tarantino movie, my sister I know will agree with this. You guys, if you probably haven't seen this because it's an underrated and sort of it's not as known as the others because it came out as part of the double feature with Robert Rodriguez, who did Planet Terror with Rose McGowan. But the first part of that, Death Proof, is probably the most fun Tarantino movie because it's just pure, like, 70s-esque schlock cinema. And uh Kurt Russell playing, it's interesting that Kurt Russell plays stuntman. What's his name in the movie? Stuntman Mike? Forget his name, but he's the stuntman driving the death proof car. My sister will tell me. What's his name? Stuntman Mike? Is that it? And in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it's a take on that because he plays the supervisor of the stuntmen on the set. He also dedicates, did he dedicate the book to Kurt Russell? Kurt Russell, I mean, Kurt Russell's awesome. No, he didn't dedicate it to Kurt Russell, but he says at one point, Kurt Russell is like, the highest achievement of these sort of quasi tough guy actors in Hollywood. Yes, Jerry says stuntman Mike. Thank you, Jerry. Um, let's see. They talk about they're going to film a movie called 100 Rifles on location in Almeria in Spain. I've been to Almeria. In fact, that was my favorite place that I went and spent. Spent 3.5 weeks in Spain in spring of 2004. I was there for Santa de Semana. I went in Sevilla and went to Barcelona, Madrid, a bunch of places. I went to the Prado Museum. I saw Guernica. Spain is amazing. It's awesome. But one of the places that I went that was my favorite was Almeria, and that's where they filmed. They had a big um, on location industry in Spain, and that's where Cliff and Rick Dalton go to film their movie. They're also shooting this movie, Red Blood. Um, and anyway, the one of the most fun parts of this movie is when they are on set and Cliff has the showdown with Bruce Lee. So this is cool because again, this takes audience expectations and kind of flips them. And Cliff Booth hates he doesn't hate him, but he does not like Bruce Lee. And the reason is, and this is what Tarantino says, is basically that Bruce Lee um was known at the time for tagging the stuntmen when he was fighting them, which means like, making he was contact it was contact. And then he would show off his kung fu and his Bruce Lee tactics and sort of make a show of this backstage with the stuntmen. And at one point, Cliff Booth is sitting there. This is in the film too. Cliff Booth is sitting there and like Bruce Lee's giving a demonstration, and it says on page 207, Bruce Lee didn't have much regard or respect for American stuntmen, and the actor went out of his way to make that disrespect obvious. One of those ways was tagging them with his flying fist and feet during fight scenes. He was warned about this time and time again, and like Robert Conrad, he always had an excuse that made it their fault. To such a degree, a whole host of stunt players refused to work with him. Now, one of the things that's a killer in terms of any entertainment industry is being difficult to work with. Um, Truth be told, Cliff didn't like Lee from the first moment he laid eyes on him, which was before Rick started shooting his guest villain gig on the show. The first time Cliff witnessed Lee's screen fighting technique was when the stuntman drove Rick to the 20th Century Fox lot for his wardrobe fitting for the following week's episode. The two men stood back away from everybody and watched Bruce and co-star Van Williams shooting an outdoor fight scene where Lee performed a lot of dazzling quicksilver kicks and Nureyev-like leaps. When Lee was finished, the crew broke into applause. Rick was definitely impressed and turned to Cliff and said, "That guy's really something, huh?" Uncharacteristically, Cliff snorted dismissively. "That guy ain't fucking shit. It might as well be Russ Tamblyn or out there. The guy's just a fucking dancer. Send Twinkletoes back to West Side Story." Rick counters, "That guy's fast as fuck. These guys are great. They look great in a movie," Cliff schooled. "There ain't no power in that shit. Yeah, he's fast. I'll give you that. But fast patty cake is still patty cake. None of these karate, people," he says, he doesn't say that, "are worth a shit in a real fight. Um, Judo's a little different. With judo, you deal with a guy you don't know what he's doing. You can toss him around a little bit, but none of these people have any power in their kicks." He's talking about the people in the movie. Um, and he says, "Hand to hand combat, man, that's where it's at. A fucking Green Beret would scramble his eggs. Everything he does is for show." Also, Bruce Lee wasn't karate. My sister can tell me about this because my sister is a what, third degree international black belt champion, world champion, my sister. And so she will know about Bruce Lee being karate. I mean, Bruce Lee had his own school, I know, and it was influenced by Muhammad Ali and all that stuff. What do you call Bruce Lee's school of martial arts? I forget, but it's like a combination of kung fu and whatever. I don't know. She'll tell me in the chat. Um, Everything Ali or Jerry Quarry does is to inflict punishment. Everything a Green Beret does is to kill. I'd like to see that guy in the jungle fighting a Japanese who outweighs him by 30 pounds with a knife in his hand and murder on his mind. Cliff snorted. That happens. The Green Beret's looking for a new chauffeur. Um, so then let's see. It says they were talking about and um Bruce Lee versus Muhammad Ali, and Bruce says his fists are bigger than my head. But Bruce admired Ali's ability and made it a point to study 16 millimeter films of Ali's fights. And in examining those films, he had made a discovery. Ali dropped his left. In a boxing ring, he knew Ali would murder him. Page 209. Yeah, no kidding. Um, and then Cliff laughs at him, and Bruce Lee, turning back to Bruce, "Get real, man. You're a fucking actor. You get a black eye, the fight's over. You get a loose tooth, the fight's over." Now, this is funny just because it's in the film, and it's again, it takes audience expectations and kind of turns them on their head. And obviously, we're going to root for Cliff in this scene, although Bruce Lee is cool. I mean, Bruce, like, you guys like watching Bruce Lee movies because they're movies, right? And Bruce Lee is amazing. But in this instance, we're talking the we're talking Cliff Booth's life overlaps with his movie career, which is interesting because we see that all the time now in terms of how I mean, just on another level, how what Jay and Jamie Kennedy were talking about last night in that, awesome interview. That was a great interview. I know everybody here's probably seen it, but if you haven't seen that interview Jay did with Jamie Kennedy, it's an awesome interview. Just talking about how Jamie Kennedy said, like, basically, like, he's on movie sets, he's part of that world, and he's aware that there are, military contractors and military people there, as part of continuity and authenticity on the set, but he's, like a firsthand experience, but he's also aware that PI, he's also aware that they are there for a larger role as part of culture creation and all the MIC aspects, right? Um, but there's the scene where this is written pretty well, what Tarantino says here on page 210. Bruce in his chauffeur's outfit, because he's there for the Green Hornet, took a cool guy pose, looked at the ground, shook his head, then looked at the stuntman and smiled, saying, "You got a big mouth, stuntman. And I'd really love closing it, especially in front of all my friends. But you see, my hands are registered as lethal weapons. That means we get into a fight and I accidentally kill you, I go to jail." Cliff came back with, "Anybody accidentally kills anybody in a fight, they go to jail. It's called manslaughter." And I think all that lethal weapon horseshit is just an excuse so you dancers never have to get in a real fight. Okay. Under the excited eyes of the crew, the two men prepared to face off against each other. What Bruce didn't know was Cliff loved 2 out of 3 challenges. They do a 2 out of 3 challenge. Though they usually took place in the parking lot, at bars at 1 in the morning. Whenever Cliff engaged in his style of contest, especially with somebody who had some fight training, he deployed a sneaky technique that was so obvious he's surprised it always works. This reminds me of a real life story, um, about someone I won't say who, but someone close to me, um, someone close, very, very close to my family that I love dearly. And his dad was a World War II fighter pilot. And after the war, he would go and get and fight in parking lots. And there's a story one time where this guy was awesome. One time he walked up to a phone booth when they had phone booths, and he was like, "Get off the phone, fella. I got to use the phone. Why are you taking so long?" And the guy was like, "Buzz off, mister," or whatever, and was rude to him. And so he went back to his truck, drove the truck up to the phone booth, tied a chain around the phone booth, and then drove off with the truck booth with the guy in it. So he kind of reminds me of that. Um, Technique is simple. He gives them the first fall. He offers very little resistance and prepares himself to withstand whatever they give. He offers so little resistance that the opponent, especially if they're a skilled fighter, it's my godfather. Um, Assumes Cliff is just some barroom tough guy in way over his head. Cliff always also knows in this type of contest, his opponent will use whatever moves or combination of moves he's the most confident with. So after the first fall, Cliff's opponent has usually shown him his big move. And if Cliff appears untrained and the guy's confident about putting Cliff away, 19 times out of 20, the other guy will use the exact same move again. And now that Cliff knows what it is, he waits for it, counters it, and drops that fucker on his ass. From Bruce's perspective, he had no intention of hurting this loudmouth honky. He just wanted to shut his big mouth and make him look a little foolish in front of the crew. For one, it would mean big trouble for Bruce if he hurt the guy. The stuntman was already complaining about Bruce hitting him, and they were informing Randy Lloyd, the stunt gaffer, that they didn't want to work with him. Plus, from showing off on set, Bruce had accidentally dislocated a set designer's jaw with a mistimed kick. If Bruce broke anybody else's jaw on the set, his ass would be grass. So they fight, and he basically Cliff lets him get the first move in and not, knocks him down. Cliff gets up, already has learned how he moves. And then Bruce Lee doesn't know that Cliff has learned how he moves and decides to do a flying kick. And instead, Cliff grabs him midair and throws him against the car. And he hears something crack in his spine when he does that. Remember, Bruce Lee broke his back later. Seth a nod to that. Bruce really didn't want to hurt Cliff. He just wanted to show him up, but Cliff wanted to hurt Bruce. If by slamming him into that car, he'd fucked up Bruce's back and neck for the rest of his life, Cliff would have been fine with that. As Bruce picked himself off the ground, he watched Cliff take his fighting stance for the third round, and he recognized it as a military hand-to-hand combat stance. Bruce was mad at this fucker for basically lying to him, and Cliff knew what he was doing. He was a killer. He could see Cliff wasn't fighting Bruce Lee. Cliff was fighting his instinct to kill Bruce Lee. And then Randy Lloyd, the stunt gaffer, played by Kurt Russell in the film, comes over and says, "Hey, break it up." And so they never get to round 3, but obviously Cliff is bested him. Moving on here on page, let's see, pages 228 and synchro again. They talk about Rosemary's Baby, and Sharon Tate goes off to buy a first edition copy of Tess of the D'Urbervilles to give to her husband as a gift. Of course, we've covered Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It's not really synchro, but we covered Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Here, we did the analysis, and Roman Polanski also directed a film called Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Let's see. We get a take on page 250 and 251 of the new era of cinema. And the anti-hero is a bloodthirsty, sadistic maniac, and it's a subversion of the Ike era personae. Says, and the villains of these new westerns, it's okay. Hold on. Actors who had spent their careers playing villains in both Western movies and practically every Western show on television, like Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, Lee Van Cleef, and James Coburn, were now suddenly the heroes and the movie stars. Those dudes are awesome. By the way, Lee Van Cleef rules. And the villains of these new Westerns weren't just bad men, they were bloodthirsty, sadistic maniacs. And any parallel with hot button political issues of the time was encouraged. Robert Blake. Remember Robert Blake? Norm wanted to wanted to interview Robert Blake. Robert Blake starred in the television show Mannix. And Robert Blake, of course, was accused of, we shall say, shooting his wife. Robert Blake was also one of the Little Rascals. Remember that? And Norm didn't get the interview at that time because he had his producer call him to set up the interview. And it was something about, like, the producer said something that pissed off Robert Blake. And then Robert Blake was basically like, "I'm not going to do an interview with a suit." Says, Robert Blake's Indian on the Run from the Man was a de facto Black Panther, and when characters got killed in these movies, they didn't just clutch their bellies, grimace, and groan, then slowly fall to the ground. They got the shit blown out of them and the blood sprayed across the screen. If Sam Peckinpah was behind the camera, they got the shit blown out of them at 120 frames per second, and the spurting red blood squibs achieved a visual poetry beyond mere Don Siegel-style brutality. A poetic passage there. Remember the First Blood, not First Blood, the movie, which is a Phoenix Program movie, but the First Blood in a movie like that was in Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty. Never really gotten Warren Beatty. I never really gave a shit about Warren, but I know he was, the Toxman of the world or whatever. Probably a creep. But I never really got Warren Beatty. But anyway, probably because I never really got him because obviously he's way older. And the first time I remember even seeing who Warren Beatty was when he did Dick Tracy. And when Dick Tracy came out, the movie, I was like so excited because I was like I think I was 9. It was the summer before I turned 10. And it was like a sort of a comic book looking movie. And it was supposed to be cool. And the Dick Tracy watch and all that. I thought it was going to be really cool. Also, they had that promotion at McDee's. You remember that? They had the Dick Tracy game at McDee's, which was really cool. But I always thought this dude is way too old, like to be cool. Do you know what I mean? He just didn't look right to me. I don't know. But if you like Warren Beatty, that's cool. I guess. We get a take on page 273 about Greek tragedy and revenge. And Tarantino himself has made reference to this sort of by way of Shakespeare. Remember, he was being criticized. "I'm gonna shut your butt down. I shut your butt down." Remember that interview? And they were talking to him about the violence in his movies. And look, the movie that really I really didn't like of his, where I thought it was gratuitous. Obviously, the gratuitous nature of his, yeah, don't forget Ishtar. right? One of the biggest bombs. One of the one of the things that I don't like about the gratuitous nature of some of his latter films would be in a movie like The Hateful Eight. I don't like what happens like with Jennifer Jason Leigh in the beginning of the movie, and there are other parts of that movie which I don't need to mention that are like extremely gratuitous. Now, Pulp Fiction obviously does that, and it's horrible, but it's it plays a role in the context of the content of the film, right? And it's supposed to show you that the characters have a like Bruce Willis's character has a redemption by saving the other bad guy, right? Butch saves Marcellus Wallace because they go through this this horrible, evil, dramatic event. But in the Hateful Eight, I found it totally different. I didn't like it, and um, when Tarantino, I don't think it was in that context. It was in another context. He was asked about the violence, and he said something like, "Look, you don't like the violence, but have you ever heard of Shakespeare?" This is a good point he made. Titus Andronicus is one of the most gratuitous, bloody plays of all time, right? The girl gets her hands cut off and replaced by tree branches. She gets her tongue cut out. The two twins are killed and baked into a pie that Titus then makes their mother eat. I mean, it's really like the violence is so much that it's almost comical. It's so gratuitous. But he makes a reference to that sort of via to Greek tragedy and revenge via Shakespeare when he says on pages 272 and 273, Caleb wasn't so drunk with power that Caleb is Rick Dalton's character in the movie within the movie in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. With power that he thought this type of terrorism would last indefinitely. At some point, the army would be called in, but they were on a 3-day march away. So by the time the Bluebellies arrived, Caleb and his men would be long gone. Caleb is a Western. Caleb only had one obstacle: Murdoch Lancer's money. When a man of principle battles a scoundrel, the scoundrel always at first has the upper hand because there are some things the man of principle won't do, while the scoundrel will do whatever it takes. That is, until the man of principle is pushed past his breaking point and beyond his nature. Most of Greek tragedy, half of all English theater, and three-quarters of American cinema operated from this premise. And that's true. You could say that sort of happens with Oedipus Rex. I mean, we've covered Oedipus Rex. Oedipus does that to himself, but that's in a sense, is what Greek revenge tragedy is about, and that's certainly remember we covered John Webster, right? The skull beneath the skin, Duchess of Malfi and the White Devil. He talks about Lee Marvin on page 309. I've always liked Lee Marvin. World War II hero Neville Brand and classic World War II dogface Lee Marvin were allowed to be drunk on set with the insurance company closing down the production. As Marvin got older, he seemed more and more haunted by the ghosts of the soldiers he'd killed on the actual battlefield. During the climax of a 1974 Western, The Spikes Gang, when Marvin's character is supposed to shoot his young co star Gary Grimes, the young lad from the summer of 42. Apparently, Grimes's look or age or both brought to mind a young soldier Marvin killed during the war. The Oscar winning tough guy sat in his trailer and drank himself into a stupor in order to have the courage to face what he'd done and what he must now pretend to do. And the proof is in the pudding. The rest of the Spikes Gang is an okay 70s Western. So that this passage also speaks to Tarantino's writing style. He's talking in a conversational vernacular and not in a way that like obviously that is elevated like Faulkner does, right? Where we're reading the actual vernacular and complete with lettering and spelling and the grammar of the characters. He's simply taking kind of a lazy man's approach to writing, but that fits this because this is a novelization of a film, and the film is for the everyday movie-going audience. It's also a statement about the audiences themselves and how they take to these people and the way that the culture's moving. Every enjoyable enough to watch, but not memorable enough to stay in the mind, except for the climactic violent shootout and the vicious expression on Marvin's totem pole face. And then here's the George C. Scott part. And George C. Scott from Virginia, George C. Scott. And George C. Scott's leading man's actor's contract was a stipulation that 3 days of the production would be lost due to the actor's alcoholism. Before he practically became a Skid Row case in the 70s, even Aldo Ray's excessive drinking was somewhat tolerated by film production companies. Later, at the end of the movie, Cliff Booth will have a conversation with Aldo Ray. They are the same age in this movie being filmed in Spain, but Aldo Ray looks 20 years older and Cliff Booth looks 10 years younger. Rick Dalton had no such excuses. His drinking is caused by a three-way combination of self-loathing, self-pity, and boredom. And then here's the part about Hamlet. Sam says, "Are you a sexy evil Hamlet?" And Rick's like, "What the fuck is Hamlet? What does that even mean?" Rick just has no concept. It's funny because it's about how these actors act in these productions, but have no concept of the literary nature or the backstory because they don't care. Sam finishes his Prince of Denmark analogy, and you're going to rule it violent, rule it cruel. You're going to rule it like a cowboy Desaad, but you're going to rule. It's weird that he mixes his metaphors there, and it's kind of an anachronism talking about Desaad in the same breath as Hamlet. The two have nothing to do with each other, except they're both nobles. Uh, let's see. Tarantino references himself on page 354, and then the see if I can find the other passage about the actual killing with the Manson family. Why don't I get into the New World Order is mentioned a couple times, Disillusion of the Ego, we talked about that. Pulp artistically, he wasn't a fine artist, but he had a sensational talent for staging drama and pulp artistically, which is a statement basically. He's talking about Kurosawa, and that's also a self-reference, a kind of an ironic self-reference on on Tarantino. Let's see. Jess said, BLA, did you see Amp Super Chat? Yeah, I think I did. I'll look at that at the end. I don't know if I read it out. Let me check it at the end, if that's okay. I just want to read a couple things from this Life and Times of Chaz Manson book here. I gave you a list of the family members. This book isn't great for it's sort of midway between revelatory and the sort of normie narrative, the Bugliosi normie narrative of the actual events, but we do get some revelatory stuff out of it, I guess. Um, talks about CIA and Owsley. There's something in here on page 86. By the time Augustus Owsley Stanley III appeared on the scene, the 29-year-old had already lived a colorful, quixotic life. Great adjective, right? The Don Quixote quixotic life. He rejected his patrician family back in Kentucky, joined the Air Force, and served as a radar technician, learned Russian as a first and last step toward becoming an Orthodox monk in that country. But then burned through a couple of marriages, taught himself auto mechanics by redesigning the engine of his MG, and finally settled on his ultimate career goal to perfect psychedelic drugs and get them into the hands of as many users as possible. Owsley invented a bogus company called Bear Research Group is that a CIA cutout? So he could order massive quantities of chemicals directly from the manufacturers, then set up a Bay Area laboratory to concoct his own. There he experimented with LSD dosage strength, testing his friends with free samples. He had plenty to spare. After visiting Timothy Leary at Leary's home in Millbrook, New York, Owsley returned to California and cracked. Leary may be the king in this little chess game, but what nobody realizes is that I'm the rogue queen. Okay, dude. We also watched shouts out to Church of the Eternal Logos, David Patrick Harry. We watched the film of Millbrook. And also, what was it that we read that discussed the Millbrook raid? Was that Don DeLeo? We discussed that in one of the books that we read. Within months, Owsley acid was everywhere in the hate, and he wasn't phased. In October 1966, when the California legislature demanded LSD used to be a misdemeanor and its sale a felony, first he began offering acid in liquid form, tinted the same blue as Whisk laundry detergent. Dealers could carry their LSD openly in Whisk bottles, which contained up to 4,000 hits. Then he purchased a pill press and began producing tablets. He changed pill color at random: white, green, pink, and purple. LSD and the Merry Pranksters and Ken Kesey. We're going to do a Ken Kesey stream soon. Um, uh, there's a lot the gang elements of this and the intel and the drug burn that doesn't really make sense in light of acid. I think because it talks about heroin, methadone, and cocaine. And I think, especially with Abigail Folger involved, I think that it was That's another example of the limited hangout they do, which is cover the story by saying it was a drug burn dealing with acid, but maybe that's the case. I don't know. I mean, that we could read Hell's Angels by Hunter S. Thompson to discuss that. Maybe it was Hunter S. Thompson that was in. Was it in? It was in Songs of the Doomed. Was that? I think it was Songs of the Doomed. It was either Songs of the Doomed or DeLeo. I can't remember which one we discussed. The Millbrook raid. I'll have to go back and look. It was. I think it was a while ago. Um, Eight residents, page 92 of this book, hope that the influx of needy newcomers would slacken as the human being faded from public memory. That possibility was lost in early April when Paul McCartney popped into the neighborhood for a quick look at a place whose reputation as a hippie haven had spread all the way to England. McCartney apparently failed to take in the piles of trash and milling herds of ragged misfits. Instead, he pronounced the hate hippies were collectively colorful and fun, and his comments made fresh headlines. A Beatle had endorsed the hate. Nice pun. That encouraged still more people to come, and among them were hardened dealers sensing limitless profits from a growing mob of consumers who believed it was their social and spiritual obligation to ingest drugs. Owsley still controlled most of the LSD market, and marijuana was smoked in the hate as often as conventional cigarettes. But these new pushers offered hard drugs, heroin and there you go, heroin and methadone, and other chemicals, encouraging harsh hallucinations and physical violence. Hate arrivals and not a few longtime residents proved indiscriminate in what they took and how often. Used syringes became commonplace on the hate sidewalks. The hard dealers wormed their way into the community and swiftly became as integral as the diggers, which is another group here. Dig, man. Oh, you dig it the most, baby. Let's see. Kenneth Anger and Lucifer Rising. It says darker philosophy. This page 105 of this book. Darker philosophies competed with hippie hedonism. In September, filmmaker Kenneth Anger rented a hate theater for a program about British Satanist Aleister Crowley. The event was called Invocation of My Demon Brother, which we discussed. We sort of discussed that because I have a book with pictures of that actual event. We discussed that in the stream that we did over on Jay's channel, talking about Wizard of Oz and Return to Oz. The event was called Invocation of My Demon Brother, included a light show with slides presenting images of Crowley's personal tarot cards, a satanic altar placed on the theater floor, footage from Lucifer Rising, Anger's film in progress, and music by the chamber orchestra. It was appropriate for the orchestra to perform. Bobby Beausoleil, its leader, was featured in Anger's film. Attendance was sparse, and Anger didn't sell enough tickets to earn back the $700 he paid to rent the theater. Worse, someone stole the Lucifer Rising film canisters. Anger suspected Beausoleil, who soon afterward left the hate for Los Angeles. Shortly after arriving in LA, Bobby met a music teacher and part-time drug dealer named Gary Hinman. And Bobby and his current girlfriend, Lori, he seemed to have a new lady every week, moved into Hinman's house in Topanga Canyon. Fate had begun lining up the human pieces on the chessboard. Well, it wasn't fate lining it up. There are other elements at play here, but also, um, Kenneth Anger, it's interesting how there are also parallels because of some of the contrast with early Hollywood in the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood movie, because obviously even the title is a reference to old time Hollywood and the golden age of Hollywood, which is also a reference to Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon, right? And um, you guys probably know this, but Bobby Beausoleil starred in Lucifer Rising, and it was Jimmy Page who was tapped to do the soundtrack for that film. It was for Lucifer Rising. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it was for Lucifer Rising. Jimmy Page was tapped to do the soundtrack for the film, and he ended up. Jimmy Page was in, doing so much OTO Crowley Satanism himself and heroin that he ended up making a completely like theremin electronic soundtrack that Anger, and he only did like 2/3 of it, and that he rejected. And then he says that Anger put a hex on him. But then also Bobby Beausoleil supposedly stole the film canisters and then ended up killing Gary Hinman and then getting convicted. On page 106 and 107, we get Anton LaVey. One of the followers who came to Charlie in his early ministry, none was quirkier or more desperate than 20-year-old of Susan Atkins. When his her mother died of cancer, Susan, 15, was saddled with the responsibility of caring for a younger brother and father who kept losing jobs. In high school, she worked part-time to help make ends meet. She tried finding solace in the Baptist church and bad behavior at home and at school. For a short time, she went to live with an uncle and aunt who found her incorrigible and sent her back to her father in alcohol, drugs, and sex. Like Lynn, she attempted suicide. Susan craved acceptance and, above all, attention. As soon as she turned 18 in the summer of 1966, Susan left home outside Los Angeles and moved to San Francisco. She went through a series of menial jobs and abusive boyfriends until that fall, when her latest lover and a friend of his invited her to come with them on a road trip to Oregon in a stolen car. They robbed a gas station on the way before being arrested by the Oregon State Police. Susan spent 3 months in jail before being sentenced to 2 years probation. She returned to Frisco, where she lived in the Haight and worked for a while as a waitress before discovering some lucrative employment as a topless dancer. Susan wasn't beautiful, but she was nice looking and exuded aggressive uh, sexuality. Her dancing attracted the attention of Satanist Anton LaVey, who was organizing a witches' Sabbath club show featuring topless female vampires. He hired Susan, and it was her dream job, eliciting the attention she craved from howling audiences by writhing naked on stage. These creeper people taking advantage of these people. But she didn't last long, and LaVey's troupe, wearing down from excessive drug use, and her okay. Susan began aimlessly wandering the hate streets with no particular plan, and then scoring drugs. And then she met Charlie. I think it was Susan who later um, was part of. Let me see. She the one who was later part of the Charlie contacted her later in prison and said she was now a member of the um yeah, Susan Atkins, yeah, she later wrote a book called Child of Satan, Child of God, typical Chaz Manson, right? And you're gonna have these voice from the same song, thanks. Uh, my mother's Eisenhower and my father's an icebox. Uh, and Charlie told her that she was now a member of the Order of the Rainbow. This is after Charlie became a Theta Clear Scientologist and, you know, all of their OTO stuff. One of the other members was this guy Zero, who that's what somebody brought up at the beginning of the stream about Bad Times at the El Royale, which is kind of a movie about a kind of it's basically Chaz Manson. Um, it was JC, it was Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was involved with Anton LaVey, not just involved. I mean, she was a full-fledged member of the Church of Satan, and then she was she wasn't was she the one who was decapitated? I always mix her up with the other lady. The other lady, the other lady, the other actress, y'all, who was the actress dancer who wore the scarf when she was driving and the scarf got tangled in the car and then she was decapitated? I think Jane Mansfield also died in a car accident or was decapitated, but I mixed those 2 up. But yeah, she was a member of the Church of Satan. There's an article also from 2008 in Vice on how on Sammy Davis Jr. And remember, Sammy Davis Jr. was a member of the Church of Satan, and he had that wasn't just a photo op that he did with LaVey. He actually had a show called Poor Devil, creepy show, and it was supposed to be a comedy where he like played Satan or something. But he got inspiration from Anton LaVey, and Michael Aquino wrote about it. And Michael Aquino saw the show and said, "Hey, this guy'd be a great advertisement for Church of Satan." That's before Aquino went off and formed the Temple set. Uh, and anyway, yeah. So, Bad Times at the El Royale. At the end of the movie, you remember the Chris Hemsworth character, who's the Chaz Manson character. He has this cult with Squeaky Fromm, Linda Kasabian characters, and he does Russian roulette with them basically, and that is how one of the family members, Zero, died. They were all playing Russian roulette. His name was Zero. His name was forget his real name. Um, and let's see, yeah, Willett's wife subsequently died while playing Russian roulette. This is page 390 in a scene grimly reminiscent of the death of Zero several years before. Then and later, no one was ever certain just how many murders might be connected to the family. Um, this says, let's see. Tex Watson also apparently uh, became a, and hopefully hopefully he did, found, converted, in prison for real, you know. But it says Bruce Davis claimed that he found the Lord in prison and wanted to share the good word with others. He began writing to Susan Atkins, page 391. She initially misunderstood the purpose of the letters, thinking he was wooing her for himself rather than Christ. But Susan was inspired enough by the letters and by her own Bible readings to experience her own epiphany in 1974. She proclaimed herself born again and set out to serve God with the same enthusiasm she once proselytized for Charlie Manson. In letters announcing her new faith, she compared herself to Moses and Paul. Susan never aimed low. She also published a memoir titled Child of Satan, Child of God. In the process, she alienated Leslie Van Houten, who thought Susan was taking the easy way out, saying that now she was forgiven for all her sins. The two women would not speak for more than 20 years. Um, Tex Watson, this is interesting. Tex Watson also announced that he had found the Lord. He began to evangelical ministry and with the help of a prison chaplain. I think this is Tex Watson's Order of the Rainbow. With the help of a prison chaplain, published a memoir about his time with the family and the miracle of his Christian conversion. In the book, he was just denied parole for like the 74th time. In this book, Tex speculated that Charlie was possessed by demons. Charlie's response included Susan as well as Tex. If they're following God the way they followed me with their own interests always in mind, then God can't be too proud. Charlie had a new faith too that was mostly intended for his remaining female followers rather than himself. He wrote to Squeaky that she should now consider herself a nun in the Order of the Rainbow. Okay. Gleek, glibble. And let's see. Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher. Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher, I think, picked up Patricia Krenwinkel hitchhiking. That's how she got to know them. And let's see, we also get a part on page 120 and 121 about Laurel Canyon and Jim, David Crosby, the Mamas and the Papas, and Frank Zappa and the Laurel Canyon crew, the whole, Dave McGowan military industrial complex crew. But it's not really of any use to go into that because you can just read this book and it's obviously it goes into that in expert depth or watch Jay's streams on it. Yes, Doris Day is Terry Melcher's mama. Um, but these guys were all degenerate, degenerate Hollywood, drug, OTO, MIC connected, people that all converged in this moment. And it's pretty interesting going back to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that he makes really no mention of any of that. Right, because it's this kind of again, it's supposed to be this meta fairy tale. So that's about all I got, you guys. That is Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the book talking about the film, and also Jeff Quinn's Life and Times of Charles Manson. Anything else that we forgot to mention? I can't think of anything right now. Coming up, we will have, of course, like I mentioned in the beginning, Streetcar Named Desire and Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams, sponsored by Toledo. This stream was sponsored by our homeboy Ryan out there. So thank you again, Ryan. Really appreciate you sponsor the stream. And I think this was a good one to do. It's always good, it's always fun talking about movies. So I hope you guys like it. I mean, I guess as time goes on, I find myself to be more of a movie nerd than I expect other people to be. I'm a total movie nerd. So, and also, uh, a lot of these books, it's like we're reading and covering the books or watching the movies, so you don't have to if you don't want to, I guess. So I want to thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you being here for the stream. Thanks everybody for stopping by. If you want to leave a comment in the comment section afterwards, please do so. Please smash the like. Please subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. Especially if you're watching the streams and you haven't subbed. For instance, if you're watching the streams and you don't have a YouTube account, but you like them or you find them valuable at all, please, you can make yourself just a throwaway burner email YouTube account and sub to me if you want. Support me by subscribing. Really appreciate that. Leaving comments, smashing the like, or sponsoring a stream, giving me ideas for things to cover, interacting with my awesome audience here and my friends and everybody chatting and in the comments, and also following my other friends who are also who are amazing, who are amazing streamers, and I get a lot from them. And so again, special shouts out to Jethro, to Natesky, to Jerry at Exposing Powerful Lies live streams, our homeboy, to Maddie at Digital Minefield, to Church of the Eternal Logos, David Patrick Carey, to Tristan, to Chase Haggard, and to Rachel Wilson at Based Homeschool Mom, who's got her own channel coming up, and to Andy BPF at the Crucible. Got a lot of people who are always uh, helping out. I get so much from my friends out there and from you guys, from all the audience, from everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful week. And drop me an email, drop me a chat, drop me a super chat, drop me some way of supporting me. Got a lot on the way. Again, Crispy says he's still waiting on the Da Vinci Code analysis and that Holy Blood, Holy Grail analysis. Probably. Shouts out to Crispy out there in the old country. Shouts out to Toledo down there in New Zealand. Shouts out to DJ. Haven't seen him in a minute in Australia. We may also do Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard coming up. We're also going to do Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. We're going to do probably somebody asked for more sci-fi because we really only done Snow Crash. So we're going to do probably Ender's Game. I've never read that before. We're also doing Glamorama by Bret Easton Ellis. Richard Hughes, A High Wind in Jamaica. We're going to do more Shakespeare. And we're going to do lots of stuff. Give me ideas for stuff to cover. So shouts out to my sister out there, especially. Most of all, shouts out to my sister. Love you. And to all my friends and family. And that's about all I got, y'all. So I hope y'all have a wonderful night and a wonderful week. Bless y'all. Love y'all. Got to keep on living. Peace. Love y'all. Peace.